Capítulo 1. The Smell of Smoke and Shame. The firewood was wet. Penny had known it before she even stepped outside that morning. She had felt it in the way the cold crept beneath the floorboards of the cabin, slow and patient, like a debt collector who had nowhere else to be. She had felt it in the stiffness of her fingers when she wrapped them around the rough wool of her shawl and pressed herself against the wall nearest the hearth, waiting for a warmth that never quite came. Still, she went to check. She always checked. The stack of pine logs she had gathered the week before sat beneath the narrow overhang of the cabin's eastern wall, half buried under a crust of gray snow. She pressed her palm against the nearest log. Wet. Not soaked through, but enough. Enough that the fire would sputter and smoke and give more headache than heat. She exhaled slowly. The village of Ashven sat 3 hours east through the forest, and the nearest woodcutter who might sell her dry timber had not spoken to her in 2 years. Not since the night of the rejection. Not since the word had passed through the crowd like a cold wind, carrying her name with it, until everyone who heard it turned their backs in the same slow, deliberate way, as if even looking at her might cost them something. Omega. Unclaimed. Rejected. Penny pressed her palm harder against the wet bark, letting the cold bite into her skin. She was 24 years old, small-boned and pale from too many winters spent mostly alone, with dark brown hair that she kept braided back because there was no one to see it loose. Her eyes were a quiet gray, the color of riverstone, and they had learned, over the years, to show very little. She was not fragile. She refused to be fragile. But she was cold. She gathered what dry kindling remained from the small bundle she kept just inside the door. Pine shavings, a twist of dried bark, 2 thin sticks that still carried some hope, and went back inside. The cabin was 1 room, a hearth, a straw pallet covered by 2 wool blankets, a table with a single chair, a shelf where she kept her herbs and small clay jars of dried berries, and a worn leather satchel that held the few tools of her trade. She was a healer of sorts, not a full-trained curandera, with guild seals and patrons, but a woman who knew which plants eased fever and which poultice drew out infection. The people of Ashven used to come to her. Before. Now the only ones who ever knocked on her door were the desperate ones, the ones whose children burned with fever at midnight, who had nowhere else to turn, who arrived with their eyes down and left without saying thank you. She built the fire carefully, coaxing it the way she had learned to coax most things, with patience and very little expectation. It caught. It smoked. It coughed like an old man, and then reluctantly began to burn. She was crouching before it, stretching her fingers toward the meager heat, when she heard the sound. Not footsteps, something heavier. The creak of branches bending under significant weight, moving through the tree line behind the cabin. Then stillness. Penny did not move. She had learned to go still when she was uncertain. It was a survival instinct, the kind the body develops on its own when the mind is too tired to strategize. The sound came again. Closer. She rose slowly, crossed to the wall where a short-handled hatchet hung on an iron peg, more for splitting kindling than for anything else, and took it down. Then she went to the door, unlatched it, and opened it. The forest was white and gray. The snow had stopped falling sometime before dawn, and the pine trees stood weighted and silent, their branches bent under the load of it. The air smelled of cold resin and something else, something animal and wild that she could not name. And there, at the edge of the tree line, stood the largest wolf she had ever seen in her life. It was standing still, watching her. Its fur was the color of charcoal and shadow, black through the shoulders and fading to dark gray along the flanks. It was enormous, easily twice the size of any natural wolf, its head level with her chest even at that distance, its amber eyes holding her gaze with an attention that felt deliberate, intelligent, not an animal. She knew immediately. Her body knew before her mind caught up. She had grown up in a pack, after all. She knew what a shifted wolf looked like when she was staring at one. This was a werewolf in its shifted form, and it was bleeding. A gash ran along its left shoulder, dark against the charcoal fur, already matting in the cold air. The wound was not fresh. It had been traveling with it. Penny's grip tightened on the hatchet, though she recognized even as she held it that the gesture was almost entirely symbolic. The wolf took one step toward her. Just one. Then it stopped, as though it understood the line it was standing on. Its amber eyes dropped, briefly, deliberately, to her left wrist. She resisted the urge to hide it. The bare skin there. The absence of a mate mark. The thing that named her for what she was to every other wolf who ever looked at her. She expected it to look away. They always looked away, or worse. Looked with that particular expression, something between pity and contempt, that she had grown to hate with a quiet and absolute ferocity. This wolf did not look away. It held her gaze, and then, slowly, in a gesture that made no sense at all, it lowered its massive head until its nose nearly touched the snow. Not a threat. A bow. Penny stood in her doorway with her wet firewood and her smoking fire, and her hatchet and her bare wrist, staring at the most powerful-looking creature she had seen in 2 years, and felt the thing in her chest that she kept most carefully locked away begin, against all her better judgment, to stir. She should have gone back inside. She opened the door wider instead. "You're bleeding," she said, because it was true, and because she was a healer, and because some habits were older than fear. The wolf raised its head. Its amber eyes in the pale winter light looked almost relieved. Capítulo 2. What the Wolf Left Behind. She did not let him inside the cabin. That was the boundary she held, the one line she drew in the snow between herself and complete foolishness. She pointed instead to the woodshed, a narrow structure attached to the eastern wall of the cabin, barely large enough for a cord of timber and her small wheelbarrow. She had built it herself 2 summers ago, with salvaged planks and iron nails she had traded a fever remedy to obtain. It kept the worst of the wind off and the roof held, though the gaps between the boards let in thin ribbons of cold air. "In there," she said, "if you want help." She half expected the wolf to refuse. The great ones always refused what was offered plainly. She had learned that much from watching the ranked wolves of Ashvin move through the village. The alphas and their betas, the way they accepted deference as though the world had been built specifically to angle toward them. But this wolf walked to the woodshed without hesitation, ducking its massive head beneath the low beam of the doorway, and folded itself down onto the earthen floor with the careful deliberateness of a creature managing pain. Penny stood in the cold for a moment longer, watching. Then she went inside, filled her clay basin with water from the iron pot she kept warming near the hearth, gathered her satchel of supplies, wrapped her shawl tighter, and followed. The woodshed was dim, lit only by the gray winter light pressing through the board gaps. It smelled of pine resin and sawdust, and now the deep wild musk of the wolf. Not unpleasant, she noticed, though she pushed the observation away immediately. She set the basin down on the wheelbarrow, knelt beside it, and looked at the wound properly for the first time. It was worse than she had thought. Long and ragged. The kind of cut made by something with an irregular edge. Not a blade, but perhaps a broken trap, or a jagged rock driven with force. It had begun to close on its own, as shifted wolves healed faster than humans. But it was fighting infection. She could smell the heat of it even in the cold air. She reached for the wound without asking permission. That was her way. Practical, direct, no ceremony around pain. Her fingers parted the matted fur carefully, assessing. The wolf made no sound, did not flinch. Those amber eyes tracked her hands the entire time with an expression that remained, somehow, absolutely calm. "This is going to hurt," she told him. the same way she told everyone. Not a warning so much as a simple fact. She cleaned the wound with water and a cloth, applied a drawing poultice she made from yarrow paste and dried pine resin, and bound it with strips of linen from the bottom of her satchel. Her hands moved efficiently, without wasted motion. This was the one place where she had never felt uncertain. Healing was the thing she understood completely. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You should shift back," she said. "The binding will hold better if you're in your human form." The wolf regarded her for a long moment. Then the air around him changed, that particular shimmer, like heat rising off stone in summer, that she remembered from watching pack ceremonies as a child. The great dark shape contracted and reshaped itself with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and where the wolf had been, a man now sat against the wall of her woodshed with his back straight and his amber eyes still holding the same expression. He was very large. Even seated, he took up the space of the shed the way a stone pillar takes up a room. Not aggressively, simply as a matter of existing. His hair was black, the same charcoal black as his wolf's fur, cut short at the sides and longer at the crown, and his face was angular and weathered, the face of someone who had spent years outdoors in difficult conditions. A scar ran along his jaw, older than the shoulder wound, pale with age. He was wearing what remained of a dark traveling cloak, which had not survived the shift well. It hung from his shoulders in tatters. Beneath it, a leather tunic, equally destroyed along the left side where the wound had been. He looked at her binding, at her satchel, at her face. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, quiet. It did not carry the theatrical weight that she associated with ranked males, the deliberate resonance that alphas often let into their tone like a weapon kept partially drawn. He spoke as someone who had no need to perform authority, because the authority simply was. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "The poultice needs to stay on until morning. If you shift again before then, you'll reopen it." He nodded once. Penny began to pack her satchel. "I don't have extra blankets to spare," she said, which was true. "But the shed keeps most of the wind out. There's dry straw in the corner." She stood, picked up the basin, and moved toward the door. "Your fire," he said. She paused. "It's smoking," he said. "The flue is partially blocked. There is a bird's nest in the upper shaft. I could smell it from outside." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that same measured calm, as though he was simply offering information he happened to have. "I noticed," she said, though she had not exactly. She had assumed the wet wood was the problem. "I can clear it," he said. "In the morning, when I can move without reopening the wound." Penny studied him for a moment. There was nothing in his expression that she could identify as manipulation. No calculation, no performance of helpfulness designed to extract something. He said it the way she had said "you're bleeding," because it was true and because he could. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She left the shed, crossed the small yard back to the cabin, and latched the door behind her. She stood with her back against it for a moment in the dim, smoky warmth of her one room. She did not know his name. She had not asked, and he had not offered it. She had treated wounds before without names. The desperate ones who knocked at midnight rarely introduced themselves. Names belonged to relationships, and she had learned to be careful about those. But as she lay down on her pallet that night, pulling both wool blankets up against the cold that the inadequate fire could not fully reach, she found herself thinking not about the wound she had dressed, or the firewood that was still wet, or the flue she had not known was blocked. She thought about the way he had lowered his head in the snow. No one in 2 years had bowed to her. No one in 2 years had looked at her bare wrist, and then continued looking at her face. She pressed her hand flat against the cold wall beside her pallet, and listened to the silence of the woodshed on the other side. Outside, the wind shifted direction. The pines groaned under their loads of snow. And in the morning, she realized, she was going to have to ask him his name. Because something about the quality of his silence felt like a question she did not yet know how to answer, and she was not a woman who left questions sitting unanswered for long. Sleep, when it came, was deeper than it had been in months. She did not examine why. Capítulo 3. Evander. She woke to the sound of something scraping against stone. Penny sat up on her pallet, both blankets sliding to her waist, and for one disoriented moment, she could not place the sound. Then it came again, a rhythmic, careful scraping from above, from the direction of the chimney. And she remembered. She rose, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and went to the hearth. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, reduced to cold ash and the faint ghost of wood smoke. She crouched before it and looked up through the flue. Gray morning light filtered down, and then a shadow moved across it, and there was another careful scraping sound, and a clump of old dry straw and debris fell into the ash pit. Then another, then another. Then the shadow moved away, and the light came down clean. Penny sat back on her heels and felt something she had not felt in a long time, something so small she almost did not recognize it. The quiet satisfaction of a problem being solved without her having to solve it alone. She heard him come down from the roof, the careful movement of a man managing a shoulder wound, finding the handhold slowly, and then the crunch of his boots in the snow as he crossed the yard. She had a fire built and lit by the time the knock came at the door. He stood in the doorway with wood chips in his hair and a look on his face that was almost apologetic. "I checked the wood pile," he said. "The logs on the eastern side are dry. The ones under the snow crust are salvageable if you split them and bring them in for a day." Penny looked at him for a moment. In the daylight, outside the cramped dim of the woodshed, he was even larger than she had registered the night before. The ruined cloak was gone. He had folded it over the woodshed beam, she would discover later, and he wore only the torn leather tunic against the cold, apparently unbothered by the temperature in the way that higher-ranked wolves often were. "Come in," she said. "Let me check the binding." He came inside, ducking under the doorframe out of habit, and stood in the center of her one room with the particular stillness of someone very accustomed to fitting themselves carefully into spaces built for smaller lives. She checked the binding. The wound had not reopened. The poultice had done its work through the night. The heat of infection had retreated, and the edges were beginning to close cleanly. She said so. "You're a healer," he said. Not a question. "Unofficially," she said, and left it at that. She poured water into the iron pot and set it over the new fire. Real heat now, the flue clear, the flames drawing straight and strong, and measured out dried oats from her shelf. It was not much, but it was what she had. "I don't know your name," she said, with her back to him. A pause. Brief, but deliberate. "Evander," he said. Penny stilled for only a moment, just long enough to be certain she'd heard correctly. Then she continued measuring the oats, keeping her hand steady, keeping her voice even. "Penny," she said. She did not turn around. She did not want to see his face when the name landed, because she knew, she had lived in this kingdom long enough to know, that the name Evander belonged to only one man. The AlphaKing of Crestmore, the sovereign of the northern territories, ruler of 7 packs, the male whose authority extended from the frost mountains in the east to the river valleys in the west. The male whose name even the village of Ashfin spoke in lowered voices. She stirred the pot. "You knew," he said quietly. "I suspected," she said, "when I saw your wolf. And you still let me into your shed." "You were bleeding," she said. "I let injured things into my shed. It's a failing of mine." She heard the ghost of something in the silence behind her. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. a controlled exhale that carried a shade of warmth in it. "I won't pretend I'm not what I am," he said, "but I also won't pretend I came here intentionally. I was tracking something through these woods. I lost more blood than I realized. Your smoke was the first sign of shelter I found." "What were you tracking?" she asked. Another pause. This one longer. "Something that shouldn't be in this part of the kingdom," he said. "I'll leave it at that for now." She turned then and looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at people who were keeping things from her. Not accusatory, just clear. He met her gaze without flinching, which she noted. "You can stay through today," she said. "The shoulder needs another treatment tonight and one more in the morning. After that, you're healed enough to travel." He nodded. "I'll split the salvageable logs," he said, "and stack them inside. You'll tear the binding. I'll be careful." She thought about arguing further and decided against it. He was not asking for permission. He was simply telling her what he intended to do, and there was something in the manner of it, not arrogant, not commanding, just honest, that she found she could not object to without manufacturing reasons. He worked through the morning in the small yard, moving with that careful, deliberate pace of someone managing around a wound, splitting logs with clean, efficient strokes of her hatchet. She watched through the small window above her herb shelf, not watching him exactly, but aware of him the way she was aware of the fire, as something that had changed the temperature of the room simply by existing. Around midday, she brought him bread and hard cheese, the good portions of what she had. He accepted them without the surprised gratitude she might have expected, and without the entitled indifference she would have expected more. He said thank you the way he had said it in the woodshed. Simple and direct, like a man who meant it rather than one who deployed it. They sat on opposite ends of the woodpile in the pale winter sun, and ate in silence. "You live alone?" he said, not unkindly. "Yes." "How long?" She considered how much of the truth to offer. 2 years, she said. He looked at her left wrist. She did not hide it this time. She let him look, the way she had let herself stop flinching at it, with a practiced stillness that cost her something every time, but that she refused to let show. "The man who rejected you," Evander said quietly. "Is he in Ashvin?" The question landed in her chest like a stone into still water. "Yes," she said. "Is he pack-ranked?" "Second beta," she said. Evander said nothing for a moment. He looked out at the tree line, at the heavy white sky pressing down over the pines. "A second beta," he said, "has no authority to perform a public rejection without alpha sanction." His voice was entirely level. If it was done publicly, it was done incorrectly. It carries no legal standing under kingdom law. Penny turned to look at him. "I know," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I knew at the time. But knowing a law and having someone enforce it are two different things when you live 3 hours from the nearest alpha seat, and the village council is made up of the rejected male's relatives." Evander looked at her then, fully, the way he had looked at her from the tree line. Something moved behind his amber eyes. Not pity. She would have retreated from pity immediately, completely, without hesitation. This was something colder and more purposeful. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, like recognition. "Eat your bread," she said, and looked away first. But the word he had said, incorrectly, stayed in her chest all afternoon, small and stubborn as an ember, refusing to go out no matter how carefully she tried to smother it. By nightfall, when she redressed his shoulder by firelight and felt the clean, strong pull of a wound closing well, she had stopped pretending she was not paying attention to every word he said. And outside, the wind changed again. And the woodshed, for the first time in 2 winters, was full of dry wood. Capítulo 4, What the Village Remembers. He was gone by the 3rd morning. Penny had known he would be. She had not allowed herself to expect otherwise, had been careful, in the deliberate way she managed most things, to keep her expectations precisely level with what was reasonable. He was the AlphaKing. He had a wound to heal and something to track through the northern woods, and a kingdom that did not pause because one of its sovereign's shoulders needed stitching. He owed her nothing beyond what courtesy required, and courtesy had been satisfied. She found a small stack of silver coins on the wheelbarrow in the woodshed. Enough to buy dry timber from the woodcutter in Ashfin for the rest of the winter, and perhaps a little beyond. Beside the coins, her hatchet, cleaned and sharpened to an edge it had not held in years. She stood looking at these things for a long moment. Then she put the coins in her satchel, hung the hatchet back on its peg, and went about her mourning. She told herself it was finished. A strange interlude in a quiet winter, the kind of small unusual event that happens to people living alone at the edges of things. She had helped someone who needed help. He had cleared her flue and split her wood and left fair payment. The transaction was complete. She almost believed it. 3 days later, the knock at her door came just before dark. It was not the tentative midnight knock of desperate parents with a feverish child. It was sharp, deliberate, with the particular rhythm of someone who expected the door to open. Penny unlatched it to find Oswin standing on her step. Oswin was the second beta of Ashfin, the man who had rejected her 2 years ago in the center of the village square, in front of 37 witnesses, with his new chosen mate standing at his side. He was broad-shouldered and fair-haired, with the kind of face that had probably seemed honest once, before she had learned to read the calculation behind it. He wore his pack rank medallion on a leather cord outside his tunic, the way he always did when he wanted to remind someone of what he was. "Penny?" he said. She said nothing. She had learned that silence, used correctly, was a more effective response than most words. "I heard something." He leaned one shoulder against her doorframe in a way designed to look casual and achieved only presumption. "Word came through the courier road this morning. Someone saw the AlphaKing's banner moving through the northern pass 2 nights ago." His pale eyes settled on her face with a careful attention. "They say he came through this part of the forest." "The forest is large," she said. "It is," Oswin agreed, "but the courier also mentioned that someone had cleared a chimney flue in this area, and there was fresh wood splitting, apparently. Someone heard the hatchet." Penny felt the cold settling behind her sternum. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the moment before a storm when the air pressure changes and the birds go quiet. "What do you want, Oswin?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. The casual posture dropped a fraction. "I want to know what you told him." "I'm a healer," she said. "I don't discuss what happens when I treat someone." "You treated the AlphaKing." He said it flatly, as though the sentence itself was an accusation. "I treat anyone who needs it," she said. "That has always been true. You know that." "What did you tell him about the village?" His voice had taken on an edge now, thin and sharp. "About me?" There it was. The real question, dressed up in all the others. Penny looked at him, at the medallion, at the calculated set of his jaw, at the pale eyes that she had once been foolish enough to trust, and felt something she had been carrying for 2 years shift quietly inside her chest. Not release, not yet, but the first loosening of a knot long held. "I told him you were second beta," she said. "It came up." The color left Oswin's face. "That's all," she said, and closed the door. She stood with her back against it and listened to the silence on the other side. He did not knock again. After a long moment, she heard his boots crunch away through the snow, moving quickly, the stride of a man with something urgent to recalculate. Penny let out a slow breath. She went to Ashfin the next morning, because she needed dried lentils and salt, and because she refused to let Oswin's visit change the shape of her day. She took the forest path, which was longer but emptier, and arrived at the village through the back gate near the tanner's yard. The village was louder than usual. She noticed it immediately. Clusters of people in the square, voices carrying across the cold air, the particular pitch of collective agitation that meant news had arrived and was being processed in public. She kept her shawl pulled forward and moved toward the market row. She had almost reached the spice merchant's stall when she heard Oswin's name spoken by someone in the cluster nearest the well, followed by the words, "Alpha's rider and yesterday evening." Penny stopped. She turned, just slightly, positioning herself behind the width of a wool merchant's hanging bolts, and listened. A rider in the AlphaKing's colors had arrived in Ashvin the previous evening, the voices said. Had gone directly to the council hall. Had delivered a sealed document to the village elder. The document, according to whoever had managed to hear something through the council hall wall, concerned a review of pack rank proceedings conducted in Ashvin over the past 3 years. Specifically, public rejections. Penny's hand found the edge of the wool merchant's table and held it. "Oswin's been summoned," one of the voices said, "to give account at the Alpha seat in Crestmore." "For what?" another voice asked. "Improper rank conduct," the first voice said. "That's all it says, improper rank conduct." The cold air moved through the market row, lifting the edges of the hanging bolts, carrying the smell of wood smoke and tallow candles and the faint iron bite of the well chain. Penny released the table edge, smoothed her shawl, purchased her lentils and her salt from the merchant who barely looked at her, which was usual. She walked home through the forest with her basket over her arm and the pale winter sky pressing down through the pine branches overhead. And she thought about a man sitting on a woodpile eating bread and cheese, his amber eyes on her bare wrist, his voice entirely level saying it carries no legal standing under kingdom law. She had thought he was simply stating a fact. She understood now that he had been stating an intention. The recognition of it moved through her like the first real heat of a fire after a long cold. Not violent, not overwhelming, but deeply, physically real. The kind of warmth that changes the temperature of the room. She was almost home when she heard the sound again. Movement in the tree line, heavier than a deer. She stopped walking. The trees were still for a long moment. Then a figure stepped out of the shadows between the pines. Not a wolf this time, but a man she did not recognize. Dark clothing, no pack colors, a short blade at his belt. He looked at her with the flat assessment of someone who had been sent to find a specific thing. "You're the healer," he said, "the one from the cabin." Penny tightened her grip on her basket. "Who's asking?" she said. He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "Someone who wants to know exactly what the Alpha King said to you," he said, "and who sent him a very detailed letter before you could say it yourself." Capítulo 5. The Man in the Trees. Penny did not run. Running was what prey did, and she had spent 2 years refusing to be prey. She stood on the forest path with her basket over her arm and the cold pressing in from all sides, and looked at the man with the flat eyes and the short blade, and made a rapid calculation. He was between her and the village. The cabin was behind her, perhaps 10 minutes through the trees. The forest on either side was dense with snow-laden pines, the ground beneath uneven and treacherous with hidden roots under the snow crust. He was not yet threatening her openly. He was talking. People who intended immediate harm rarely opened with questions. "I don't know what you think you heard," she said, keeping her voice level. "But I'm a healer. I treated a wound. There was no conversation worth reporting to anyone." "That's not what Oswin believes," the man said. He took one slow step toward her, casual. The kind of step that was designed to demonstrate that he felt no urgency, because urgency was her problem, not his. "He believes you gave the Alpha King information about village proceedings. Specific information about a specific rejection." "Oswin can believe what he likes," Penny said. Another step. He was perhaps 15 feet from her now, close enough that she could see the quality of his clothing, not a common village man. The stitching on his cloak was fine, the boots were good leather, well kept. Someone was paying him, and paying him well. He also believes, the man continued, that the AlphaKing may return, and that when he does, certain parties would prefer that you not be available to provide further accounts. The sentence landed precisely the way it was intended to. Not ambiguous, not subtle. Penny set her basket down on the snow. It was a calculated movement, both hands free, the basket no longer something that could be grabbed and used to pull her off balance. She saw the man register it, saw the brief reassessment in his eyes. "You should go back to whoever sent you," she said, "and tell them this approach was poorly considered." He reached for the blade at his belt. The sound that came from the trees to Penny's left was not loud. It was almost quiet. A single heavy footfall, a branch displaced, and then the enormous dark wolf was simply there, between her and the man, its charcoal shoulders level with the man's chest, its amber eyes carrying none of the calm she had seen in her woodshed. The man went absolutely still. The wolf did not growl. It did not display its teeth. It simply stood in the path and looked at the man with the particular quality of attention that required no elaboration. The man's hand moved away from the blade. Then he stepped back. Once. Twice. His careful professional composure had developed a visible crack, a slight unsteadiness in the shoulders, a swallow that moved his throat. He turned, without running, and walked away through the trees in the direction he had come from, and the sound of his boots in the snow faded until the forest was quiet again. The wolf turned to look at her. Penny breathed out. It came out longer than she intended, shaky at the edges, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum for a moment and waited for her heartbeat to settle. "I thought you were tracking something," she said. The air shimmered, and Evander stood where the wolf had been, in the same dark traveling clothes she had first seen, the shoulder fully healed now, the bearing entirely straight. He looked at her with those amber eyes, and something that lived very close to anger in them, though it was not directed at her. He said. "I tracked it back here." He picked up her basket from the snow and held it out to her. She took it. Their fingers did not touch. She noted with some irritation that she noticed. "Oswin hired him?" she asked. "Oswin contacted a man named Drest," Evander said. "A facilitator. Someone who removes complications for people with rank and money and poor judgment." He fell into step beside her on the path toward the cabin, naturally, as though it had been decided. "Oswin sent a letter to Drest the morning after my rider arrived in Ashfen. He believed, apparently, that removing you from the situation would complicate any testimony regarding the rejection proceedings." "He wanted me gone," Penny said flatly. "He wanted you unable to speak," Evander said, and the flatness of his own voice carried more weight than volume could have. They walked in silence for a moment, the snow crunching beneath their boots, the pines standing close on either side. "How did you know to come back?" she asked. "I didn't leave," he said. She stopped walking. He took 2 more steps before stopping as well, and turned to look at her with an expression that carried no apology in it, only honesty. "I tracked Dress to the edge of the Ashfen Road 2 days ago," he said. "I knew he'd been contacted by someone in the village. I didn't know the target until I followed him this morning and saw where he was going." A pause. "I should have told you there was a threat. That was my error." Penny looked at him standing on the forest path in the pale winter light. The black hair, the scarred jaw, the amber eyes that looked at her bare wrist and then at her face, and did not perform either pity or contempt. "You stayed 2 extra days," she said, "watching my cabin." "Yes," he said. Simply. "Without telling me." "Yes." She should have been angry. She examined the feeling carefully and found that it was more complicated than anger, threaded through with something warmer and more unsettling that she did not have a clean name for. "Next time," she said, "tell me." Something shifted in his expression. The controlled stillness of it broke, very slightly, at the edges. "Next time" implies a continuity I hadn't presumed to assume, he said. "Don't be careful with your words at me," she said, and started walking again. "I'm a healer. I know when someone is managing a wound instead of treating it." She heard him follow, his steps resuming behind her. After a moment, she heard the quietest exhale, controlled, but carrying that warmth in it again, the sound adjacent to a laugh. Capítulo 6. Counsel and Cost. They reached the cabin as the light was failing. Penny built the fire, the flue drawn clean and straight, the dry wood catching immediately, the flames filling the room with honest heat, and put the lentils on to soak, and did not ask whether he planned to stay, because the answer was evident, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. Evander sat in her single chair, which was not built for someone his size, and said nothing while she moved around the room. He was, she was learning, exceptionally comfortable with silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone withholding, the settled silence of someone who had no need to fill space unnecessarily. "Tell me about Drest," she said, when the pot was on and the room was warm. "He operates out of the Veldmere territories," Evander said. "He's been hired twice before for similar work, both times by ranked males facing accountability proceedings for pack law violations. Both times, the key witnesses became unavailable before the proceedings concluded." Penny turned from the hearth. "What happened to them?" "One left the territory voluntarily," he said. "Enough pressure applied to enough people around her that staying became untenable. The other—" He paused. "The other was found by someone loyal enough to intervene in time." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pine boughs in long, cold sweeps. "So Oswin has done this before," Penny said. "Oswin has paid someone who has done this before," Evander said. "The distinction matters legally, but the outcome of the accountability hearing will not depend solely on your testimony." He looked at her steadily. "I have the letters, the ones he sent to Drest. They were intercepted by my courier network before Drest received the second payment." "What happens to Oswin?" she asked. "He'll be brought before the Alpha Council at Crestmore. The improper rejection, the hiring of Drest, the pattern of conduct, it will all be heard together." Evander's voice was level, but underneath it was something solid and immovable. "He will not hold rank in any pack under my authority after this proceeding. His medallion will be surrendered." Penny sat down on the edge of her pallet and looked at the fire for a long moment. 2 years. 2 years of wet wood and smoking fires and midnight knocks and people who looked away. 2 years of a bare wrist and a name that meant unclaimed, unwanted, set aside. "It won't undo it," she said quietly. "No," Evander agreed. "It won't." She appreciated that he did not pretend otherwise, did not offer her the soft comfort of a false correction. He simply acknowledged the truth of it and let it stand, and in doing so treated her with more genuine respect than most people had managed in 2 years. "There's something else," he said. She looked up. "Drest did not come alone," he said. "The man on the path was a scout. Drest himself is still in this territory, and he has 2 others with him. They'll know the scout failed. They'll reassess." His amber eyes held hers. "I won't leave you here alone tonight." Penny looked at him sitting in her small chair in her one-room cabin, the fire between them, the wind outside and the forest beyond that. And the understanding settled through her with the quiet certainty of something that had been true for several days already, and was only now being said plainly. "All right," she said. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and dense, covering the forest path and the woodshed and the woodpile, and the place in the snow where a great dark wolf had stood between her and a drawn blade, covering everything quietly and completely, the way winter always did, patient, thorough, and absolute. Inside, the fire burned clean and straight and warm. Capítulo 7. Dressed. The snow fell through the night without stopping. By morning it had buried the woodpile to the second log and smoothed the forest path into an unbroken white line that showed nothing of what had passed along it the day before. Penny stood at her small window and watched it, and drank the weak tea she had made from dried chamomile, and thought about the man named Dressed somewhere out in the white and cold, reassessing. Evander had slept in the woodshed. She had offered him the floor of the cabin, which was closer to the fire, and he had declined with the same simple directness he applied to everything. The shed is sufficient. She had not argued. She had given him the second wool blanket, which was not much against a winter night, but he had taken it without comment, and she had reminded herself, lying awake on her pallet in the dark, that wolves ran warmer than humans, and that her concern was therefore unnecessary. She had not slept well. She heard him in the yard before first light, the quiet, deliberate sounds of someone moving with purpose through the snow. She dressed quickly and went to the door. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, very still, his face turned toward the forest, not in wolf form, simply watching, the way a man watches something that has not yet fully revealed itself. "They moved last night," he said, without turning. "Dressed and the two others. They circled the cabin from the north." Penny looked at the snow along the tree line. She could see it now. The slight disturbance beneath the fresh fall, the compressed irregularity that meant footsteps had passed there and been half covered by subsequent snowfall. "They didn't approach," she said. "They were establishing positions," he said, "seeing what they were dealing with." He turned then, and his amber eyes were clear and entirely awake, the look of someone who had not slept because he had been doing something more useful than sleeping. "They know I'm here. That changes their calculation, but doesn't end it. Dressed doesn't withdraw from a contract without completing it or being paid to stop." "Then we need to give him a reason to stop," Penny said. Evander looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, more like recognition of a mind working along a useful line. "My second rider is 2 hours east," he said. "I sent for him yesterday. He'll arrive by mid-morning with 4 of my guard." "Then we wait," she said. "Then we wait," he agreed. She made oat porridge. They ate at the table, she in her chair, he on the upturned wheelbarrow she had brought in from the shed, the fire burning straight and clean between them. The domesticity of it should have felt strange. It did not. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her. "The thing you were tracking when you came through these woods the first time," she said. "Before you found my cabin. Was it dressed?" A pause. Shorter than the ones before. He was, she had noticed, pausing less. "I had reports of a facilitator operating in the Northern Territories," he said. "Hired for a third time by someone with rank and something to lose. I came personally because the previous 2 interventions had been delegated and had not resolved cleanly." He turned the wooden spoon in the bowl with a deliberate motion. "I did not know the target. I knew only the territory." "And then your horse threw you," she said. "Or something like that." "A trap line," he said. "Illegal, set deep in the forest where no trapper has claim. It caught my boot during a shift transition. I went down a ravine embankment." A pause. It was not a distinguished moment. Penny looked at him across the table. The AlphaKing of Crestmore, sovereign of 7 packs, sitting on her upturned wheelbarrow eating oat porridge and describing falling down a ravine with the composed candor of someone who had made peace with his own imperfections. She felt something open in her chest, small and careful. like a window being unlatched on the first warm day of spring. "You should have seen the other ravine," she said. He looked at her. It was not a good joke. She recognized it was not a good joke even as it left her mouth. But something at the corner of his scarred jaw moved. A shift, a softening. And then he laughed. Not the controlled exhale she had heard before. An actual laugh. Brief and low, and entirely unguarded. And it changed his face completely. Made him look younger. Made him look like a man instead of a sovereign. She looked back at her porridge before he could see what was happening to her expression. The riders arrived at mid-morning, as promised. 4 guard in the AlphaKing's colors, and a 5th man, the 2nd rider, who reported quickly and quietly to Evander at the edge of the yard. Penny watched from the cabin doorway and noted how the guards moved, how they positioned themselves without being told, the silent efficiency of people who had done this many times under the same command. Drest made his move an hour later. He came from the north, as Evander had predicted, with his 2 men flanking him through the tree line. He was broad and gray-bearded, with the bearing of someone who had survived a great deal through practicality rather than sentiment. He stopped at the tree line when he saw the guards. His assessment was rapid and professional. Then he saw Evander. The 2 men looked at each other across the snow-covered yard for a long moment. "Drest," Evander said. "My lord," Drest said, and the title came out with a precision that managed to be respectful and resigned simultaneously. A man acknowledging a game that had ended. "The contract is dissolved," Evander said. "The man who hired you is being brought before the Alpha Council at Crestmore. His assets are frozen pending the proceeding. You will not be paid the remainder." A pause. "Walk away from this territory. If I find your name in another contract in any land under my authority, the next conversation will not be conducted across a yard." Drest looked once, briefly, with professional curiosity, at Penny in the doorway. Then he looked back at Evander. "Understood," he said. He turned and walked back into the trees, and his 2 men followed, and the forest absorbed them without ceremony. Capítulo 8. What the shed kept. The guards made camp at the edge of the yard. The 2nd rider returned east with letters. The forest was quiet. Penny sat in the woodshed in the pale afternoon light, not because she needed anything from it, but because it was the first place she had made a decision that she was beginning to understand had changed things. She sat on the old wheelbarrow and looked at the dry wood stacked clean along the walls, and thought about all of it. The wet wood, the smoking fire, the wolf in the snow with its head bowed, the coin on the wheelbarrow, the man on the path, the laugh across the table. Evander found her there. He stood in the doorway of the shed, the way he had stood in the doorway of the cabin. Too large for it, careful about the beam. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. "The council proceeding begins in 4 days," he said. "I need to be at Crestmore." She nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came into the shed and stood with his back against the wall beside the stacked wood, close enough that she could feel the warmth he put off, the particular steady heat of a high-ranked wolf. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to ask it plainly, because I find that plain questions are the only kind worth asking." Penny looked at him. Her heart was doing something it had not done in a very long time, and she kept her face still with the practice of 2 years of keeping things contained. "When the proceeding concludes," he said, "I intend to return to this part of the territory. Not for a diplomatic purpose. Not for a tracking purpose." His amber eyes held hers with the same directness he had applied to every single thing since he had walked into her woodshed, bleeding and enormous, and had lowered his great dark head in the snow. "For you, if you are willing." The woodshed was very quiet. Outside, the guards moved at the edge of the yard, their boots crunching in the snow, their voices low. Penny felt the thing she had been keeping locked for 2 years, not just since the rejection, but before it, the long-practiced habit of not wanting things she was not certain she could have, begin to unlock itself with a slowness that felt almost physical. "You're the Alpha King," she said. "Yes," he said. "And I'm an unclaimed Omega, from a village 3 hours from the nearest Alpha seat, who treats fevers for people who don't say thank you." "Yes," he said, and waited. She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar on his jaw, and the straight bearing, and the amber eyes that had never once looked at her bare wrist and then away. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "when you come back." Something moved across his face, slow, certain, like the first light coming over the frost mountains in the east. "I will," he said. Epilogue. Spring and after. He came back. He came back 41 days later, when the snow was pulling back from the southern edges of the forest, and the first muddy green was pushing up through the cold ground beneath the pines. He came with 4 guards, and his second rider, and a letter from the Alpha Council sealed with the king's own mark. And he came to her door in the early morning when the mist was still in the trees, and knocked with the same sharp, deliberate rhythm she had heard that first time. Oswin had stood before the council. He had answered for the rejection and for Drest, and for the years of conduct that the proceeding had surfaced when it began pulling at the threads. His medallion had been surrendered on the 2nd day of hearing. He had left Ashfin before the ruling was formally recorded, which was, Evander told her later, the most sensible decision the man had made in years. The village of Ashfin had received the ruling, with the collective recalibration of a community that had been wrong and knew it, and was deciding how to arrange its face around that knowledge. It was not a comfortable process. Penny did not require it to be comfortable. She required only that it be true. Evander asked her plainly, on her doorstep in the spring mist. She answered him plainly. They were bonded at Crestmore 6 weeks later, in the old ceremony with the old words, in the great hall with the high stone arches and the long fire pits, and the gathered council and the guard. Mira, the old curandera from the Ashfin Road who had taught Penny her first herbs at age 9, and had been one of 37 witnesses to the rejection 2 years before, stood in the hall and wept without embarrassment. She had made the 3-hour journey on a borrowed horse, and arrived with mud on her boots and complete composure, and sat in the front row as though she had every right to be there, which Penny had made certain she did. The bonding mark settled on Penny's left wrist over the bare skin that had been her name for 2 years, and the warmth of it moved up her arm and into her chest and stayed there, permanent and real, the way the heat of a fire stays in stone long after the flames have gone. She did not stop being a healer. Evander had not asked her to. She kept her knowledge and her satchel and her herbs, and the practical directness she applied to wounds and people alike. And at Crestmore, she found that there were many who needed those things, and that having the standing to offer them without someone deciding whether she was permitted to was a different kind of warmth entirely. Quieter, slower, and very deep. The cabin at the edge of the forest she kept. Not to live in, but because it was the place where she had opened the door on a bleeding wolf in the snow and made a decision that had changed everything, and some places deserved to be kept for what happened in them. The woodshed was always full of dry wood. That was Evander's doing, a standing order to the Crestmore supply keeper, renewed each autumn, timber delivered to the cabin before the first frost. She had told him once that it was unnecessary. He had looked at her with those amber eyes and said nothing at all, and she had understood that some things were not about necessity. She had stopped arguing with him about things that were not about necessity. It was a small and genuine happiness. The winter that had almost broken her, the wet wood, the smoking fire, the bare wrist, the village that looked away, became the winter she looked back on not with grief, but with a clear-eyed understanding of what it had cost her and what it had, in the end, made possible. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed a door to open, and she had opened it herself. Everything after that had simply been a matter of letting the right things in,